It would be good for you as well as good for the speakers if you wouldn't mind moving up to the tables in the front. The views are better, the price is the same, so come on up and enjoy the weather up here. It would be great to have you. This is our, in a sense, closing session, but I also think it may well be our opening session. The thing I'd like all of you to do is to imagine when the show is over in an hour and a half or so, and there will be a reception afterwards, to see if some things we've said, some things the panels have talked about, provoke you to imagine what you or your institutions might want to do further. We don't have any agenda, there's no straw man, but if something here is provocative enough to get you to think about working with someone else, collaborating with them, that would be terrific. And Philanthropy New York, me at Duke, Garrett, NYU, we'll be happy to think about it with you. So this session we call our rapid fire talk, and it's going to involve a little choreography, but I think we can do it. We will have three talks of about 10 minutes each, 10 to 12 minutes, by three really quite distinguished speakers. All of them, as I mentioned before, have some considerable engagement in the world of philanthropy, and they know philanthropy, but they haven't been philanthropists. And so it was our idea to see what they would say to us from their outsider view and challenge us to see what might be done next. We'll work it out this way. Our three speed talkers, if you will come up one at a time. So as the first one sits down, the second one will come up. And I'll tell you who they are, so you can be prepared for them. Our first speaker is Andrew Rasiej. He's a technology entrepreneur. He's been working in this field for more than 20 years. He focuses on engagement between technology, transparency, diplomacy, and how people can engage, attach, and make a difference with the use of technology and not. He's advised Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Tom Daschle, and others. Is on the board of, I'm trying to remember. Well, he created mouse.org and is very much alive and engaged in the political activities that go on today. Our second speaker comes from a slightly different place. It's Ai-jen Poo. Ai-jen is the director of National Domestic Workers Alliance. She's been organizing immigrant workers since 1996. In 2000, she founded the Domestic Workers United New York organization, and that spearheaded the successful passage of the state's historic Domestic Workers Bill of Rights of 2010. She speaks out for those who don't have much of a voice and has become a very powerful spokesperson for those who need it and will eventually have it. Our third speaker is the Attorney General of New York, Eric Schneiderman, a good friend of the nonprofit sector, who has taken care since his coming there of being very attuned to the needs of the sector and helping us wherever he can. He's been very concerned about legal and regulatory issues that affect the sector, charitable contributions included, and if there's anyone who in a fairly short period of time has garnered an enormous depth of knowledge about what we do and how, it is the Attorney General of New York. So let's, after the three speakers, we're going to ask the three producers who produced this morning's panel, Stan, Angela, and Jim, to come up and sit here and sort of chat among themselves. I'll ask a few questions to see what we can bounce off each other and take the discussion a little bit further, and then turn it over to you folks and have a go. So let me begin by introducing Andrew Rasiej, and off we go.
feel a little bit like Einstein's chauffeur when I look at all the people in the room, and they're distinguished people and accomplished people in the room. You know, I don't know if you know the story about Einstein's chauffeur. He was ferrying Einstein around, you know, sometimes 3 or 4 speeches a day for about 3 months. And at one point, at the end of 3 months of doing this, Einstein fell in the back of the car and just said he was exhausted and just couldn't do it anymore. And the chauffeur said to him, you know, Professor, I've been watching and listening to your speeches so many times I could give it myself. Why don't we switch places at the next spot? And so they went to some university, and of course they changed hats, and the chauffeur got on stage and delivered the theory of relativity speech exactly on the perfect cadence without missing a beat. And when he was finished, a professor in the audience raised his hands and asked an incredibly complicated question. And again, the chauffeur, just without missing a beat, said, you know, that question is so simple, I'm going to let my chauffeur answer it. So I'm very grateful to be here. Thank you, Ed, and thank you all of you for coming to this very important event. So how many of you have smartphones? Well, get ready. There's going to be 6 billion of them in about 10 years. And the ones that we're all going to have 10 years from now are going to make the ones we have today look like Motorola briefcase phones that we were carrying around 15 years ago. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because this is going to change everything. Does anybody recognize this slide? Tahrir Square during the Arab Spring in Cairo, the first iteration of the Arab Spring in Cairo. So during that protest, many Egyptians were following the protests online. There were many people using social media and technology to get the message about the protests out, to organize the protesters using Facebook and Twitter. But many Egyptians were basically at their homes online. And at some point, Mubarak ordered Vodafone to shut off the internet in Egypt. And as a result, many of those people did the same thing we would have done if the internet or electricity was shut off in New York, went out onto the streets, swelling the protests beyond what they were already achieving. And at that point, a blogger and an academic who's part of the personal democracy community, the one that I help organize, posted a great blog post where he stated, you can shut off the public internet, but you can't shut off the internet public. And what I'd like to try to share with you this is the notion of the internet public is a new type of human being that for whom the internet is central to their lives, either economically, spiritually, culturally, politically, even emotionally. And it's not just generational, although it does skew younger. This is a phenomenon that is occurring across the planet, and you can see evidence of it in the ACTA protests in Europe, the populist protests in Israel, the Coney 2012 phenomenon that occurred last year, the Susan G. Komen Planned Parenthood battle, and even in China, where you think that the security apparatus would prevent the internet public from having a voice, when Chen Guangchen was fighting for his release, hundreds of thousands of Chinese posted pictures of themselves wearing sunglasses on the internet. And we even see it in Gangnam Style. I mean, 1 billion views. It's a cultural phenomenon. Whether you like Gangnam or not, or can do the dance, something has changed. But you can also see it in evidenced here. And I'll tell you a quick story firsthand. I happen to chair something called the New York Tech Meetup, which is a 30,000-member organization representing mostly the startup community, but people interested in technology. Our organization grows by about 250 people a week. And back on January 18th, 2012, we participated in a protest for what was known as the SOPA and PIPA bills, which you may have heard about. And we went to Senator Schumer's and Gillibrand's offices on 3rd Avenue to show our displeasure at the fact that they were sponsoring those bills. We sent one email to our membership, and 3,000 of our members came to that protest. But what was interesting was what happened afterwards, which was Senator Schumer called us up and said, I've never seen that many people come to a protest that didn't arrive by bus. Could someone please explain this to me? And he asked for a gathering of 20 of the leaders from the tech community to get together with his senior staff. And he said, quote unquote, "I understand that you've created a new political currency that has nothing to do with money per se. I want to learn how to harness this. I want to learn how to use these technologies, and I hope that you will learn to trust me so that we can work together to overturn Citizens United and to make our democracy stronger." And since then, his staff has been in touch with many of these same people, and he has not yet called a single one of them, and many of you know Chuck, has not asked any of them for any money. But let's move on. The internet public has a huge impact on philanthropy, especially in the area of budget cuts. So in 2012, the budget for the National Endowment for the Arts was $146 million. But now platforms, not just programs, are being built using technology that are transforming the way we fund the arts. Kickstarter has raised $319 million using a platform that didn't exist 2 years ago. This is a map of a project called, from a program called, or a platform called Ushahidi. Ushahidi was founded in Kenya during their election cycle, I think 5 years ago, 2007, 8, where young activists were concerned about the government that was using violent methods to crack down on protests who believed that the election was corrupt. And they used this map to allow citizens to post their reports of violence by the government on citizens using text messaging and making that information available on a map. Well, the interesting thing about that project was that they built their platform in a way that was open source and allowed others to use that same mapping tool for other kinds of events. And so this is an example of it being used to map the Haiti earthquake, but it's also used for everything from mapping parking spaces during a storm to forest fires in California. And it's another example of platform philanthropy, not program philanthropy. Now, I ran for public advocate in 2005 on a platform of making New York City as the most wired city in the world, and I had a fist up in the air, which was taken from the Tennessee Valley Authority, talking about or indicating the quest for electricity, and I used it for my campaign poster, and now I see that someone's taken it and given us a sense of what I would call app power. Well, to give you a sense of app power as it relates to platform philanthropy, let me tell you a little bit about the Sunlight Foundation, and full disclosure, I'm the senior technology advisor to this organization. Sunlight Foundation is an organization that was founded in 2006 with the sole purpose of digitizing all the influence data that it could possibly find in Washington and elsewhere to illuminate and to empower activists and organizations and citizens to be able to hold their members of Congress and elected leaders accountable. And Sunlight is really a truly digital platform, not just an NGO working at solving money in politics. They're building platforms that allow their information to be easily shared and accessed by thousands of organizations, if not tens of millions of citizens. So this is a chart that shows the access to the Sunlight APIs. Now, how many of you know what an API is? So API is an automatic processing interface, which basically makes it possible for a server that has a great deal of information to make its information available automatically to other servers. And this indicates how many times Sunlight's APIs have been utilized and how many times it's been hit, in effect. And you can see there's a drop-off at the end of last year, which is indicative of the fact that the election was over and there was actually less interest in the issue of money in politics. But to give you a sense of the power of platform philanthropy, these are the number of keys that Sunlight has given out to their API, and a key is basically a license or a permission to another organization to access that data automatically to empower their websites to be able to share the information from the Sunlight APIs with their constituency. Now, another example of thinking about platforms as opposed to programs, I started a program in education called Mouse in 1997, where we started wiring public schools to the internet here in New York. And after 3 years, we realized that wiring public schools really wasn't the issue. The issue was that we needed to train the students and the teachers how to use the technology that we were installing in the schools. So we developed a program to train students and teachers, train students to be the systems admins for their schools. And on our board at the time, there was a great deal of debate about whether or not we should start chapters in other cities. And ultimately, we picked a strategy, which was, instead of actually building chapters in other cities, we would open source our curriculum and basically make it available to other organizations throughout the world. And today, Mouse's program, the student-led tech support program, is active in 10 states, 20 countries, and 150 schools in New York. And our budget is about $2 million. But we still have a big digital divide. And the reason why we have a big digital divide is that we can talk about how we wire public schools as much as we want, but we're not wiring our students at home. $80 or $90 or $100 a month for access to the internet is beyond the reach of most working class families. And in the session before lunch, we heard how a third of America's citizens at the lower end of the economic scale are not participating, are not having their voices heard. One of the major reasons is because they're not getting online. And one of the biggest reasons why they're not getting online is because we have a duopoly in our country between the telcos and the cable industry that have handicapped and have set us back in order to be able to compete in the 21st century economy. This slide shows we pay the highest rates for broadband in the world. We are about the middle in terms of its speed. And this chart will just show you the amount of influence peddling of money from telcos that has gone into the pockets of congressmen in order to influence the regulatory environment around broadband. We can't wait 10 years for someone to figure out how to get the United States on equal footing with the rest of the world's economy. And we can't wait for our democracy to figure out how to get to that other 30% of people who don't have a voice unless we solve this problem. And I'm very happy to see that the Attorney General is here, who has expressed some interest in this subject. I hope that he picks up the ball on this and starts asking some very serious questions which aren't being asked in Congress and certainly not being asked enough at the FCC and other regulatory agencies. But what about you? So how many people here are concerned about privacy? Your own privacy when you're online? Well, you all texted earlier, by the way. We collected all your phone numbers. But seriously, of those of you who raised your hands and those of you who didn't, how many of you have actually read a terms of service all the way through? All the way, one person, two people, all the way through before you clicked yes. Think about that. Do you have any idea what you gave away? Our hunger for technology, these apps, they're all wonderful, but we're not taking personal responsibility for what we're giving away. We're not asking ourselves critical questions about that. And the reason I'm putting up this particular slide is because if you want to think about how we're going to transform philanthropy, you'll have to spend some time thinking about how you're going to transform yourself. We all have trouble getting past our past. It's a struggle. I grew up before the internet, went to school before the internet was born, and I'm still trying to figure out how to configure my RSS feed or my TweetDeck or how to log into Twitter sometimes. But I know the technology is changing the equation, and unless we as philanthropists recognize the power of it as a tool for good, it will be used as a tool for bad. And the biggest takeaway I can give you is for us not to think of technology as a slice of the pie. It's actually the pan that's dynamically supporting and changing the way our world works. It's not a bunch of startups. It's not just a bunch of apps. It's a fundamental reordering of the world by the internet public. And if you want to think about how to challenge yourself in your jobs and your personal life, I leave you with this quote by Buckminster Fuller. I'll give you a second to read it. The future is yours if you choose it, not your organization. And the future is ours if we work together. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me on such a star-studded lineup. I'm truly honored. I want to begin today by introducing you to my lovely grandmother. She is 87, and she lives in Southern California. She loves to go for walks in the afternoon and meet her friends for tea. She plays a lot of mahjong. How many of you play mahjong? Yeah, okay. If there's such a thing as a mahjong shark, that is my grandmother. And she watches kung fu soap operas and goes to church twice a week. And she's 87 and lives an incredibly vibrant life. And so you might want to know what her secret is. Well, she's two, actually. Her first secret is that she makes sure to laugh heartily at least 3 times per day. And the other, perhaps more fundamental, is Mrs. Sun. Mrs. Sun is my grandmother's caregiver. She comes to my grandmother's home a couple of times per week to help with the cooking and the cleaning and the washing and some chores that she can't do on her own. And when my grandfather had a stroke, Mrs. Sun was there day in and day out, caring for my grandfather and supporting my grandmother. Mrs. Sun is as warm and constant as her name and is always there for my family. My grandmother taught me pretty much everything that is meaningful and matters in life. Well, she potty trained me, which was useful, still proves useful. And she also taught me most of my values that I hold true, that really shape who I am and how I look at the world. And one thing she always said is that caring is life's greatest gift, and that we must always remember to appreciate the people who take care of us. Like nannies and elder care workers and housekeepers around the country, Mrs. Sun contributes so much to my family, to our community, to the country, and to the economy. And yet, still, most domestic workers are earning poverty wages with little to no worker protections or basic benefits. These are the people who care so much for us and are not cared for in return. And that is why I run an organization of Mrs. Suns, women like Marlene champion. She's a domestic worker right here in New York, and she's seen it all. Wonderful employers who have stayed in touch with her their entire lives, as well as the ones that ask you to clean the floor with a toothbrush. Marlene helped us pass the Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights in New York State, and there are 4 more bills just like it in state legislatures around the country, so we are making progress. A few years ago, Marlene started asking for training in elder care, and many of her colleagues did as well. More and more domestic workers started being called upon to take care of the aging relatives of their employers. And it was such a pattern that we started to really take notice. We realized that they were experiencing firsthand a tremendous change in the country. On the one hand, communities of color, particularly immigrant communities, are growing. And we often hear about the fact that by the year 2040, we will be a majority-minority nation. This change is clearly beginning to shape American politics as we look at immigration reform on the horizon and many other things. But there's another change happening, the age wave. People are living longer and the baby boom generation is starting to turn 65 at a rate of a person every 8 seconds. 10,000 people per day, 4 million people per year turn 65 in America. Some call it a silver tsunami. Whatever you call it, it has arrived. Take Ohio, for example. Today, Ohio is 83.6% white, 12.4% African American, 5% immigrant, including Latino. And this is a map of Ohio in 2000. The orange counties have 22 to 25% of the population over the age of 60. This is Ohio in 2010. The red counties are where 25 to 35% of the population is over 60. This is Ohio in the year 2020. And we all know the significance of Ohio come election season. Yes, the age wave will be shaping our lives. And every single one of us is probably experiencing and feeling it in some way already. Every one of us probably has a story about someone we love who has Alzheimer's, or who had a heart attack, or simply should not be driving or using a stove alone or on their own. The need for care and support for the aging and people with disabilities is great. And we're already feeling it. We can't afford it, we can't manage it, or the people we want to hire are undocumented or untrained. From every angle, it's just not quite working. And whether we're care workers or consumers, we're all challenged by it in some level, and we're dealing with it for the most part in isolation. So we at the Domestic Workers Alliance began meeting with aging and disability advocates, home care unions, immigrant and civil rights organizations, and women's groups. And what we realized is that there's a tremendous opportunity here to create a win-win solution for everyone, to create a whole new approach based on care as an American value, one that brings together the interests of families and individuals who need care and support with the people and families who provide that care and support to create a more caring economy and society for all of us. Our campaign is called Caring Across Generations, and we are building what we call a Caring Majority Alliance, putting forward a vision for the future that fundamentally ties our interests together across diverse experiences. We're working in 17 cities with a coalition of more than 200 organizations to create 2 million new quality jobs in home-based care over the course of the next 10 years. And we want to make sure that every last one of those jobs is a job that you can take pride in and support your family on, with career pathways and a road to citizenship for the immigrant care workforce. And we want to make sure that care is accessible and affordable for every single family who needs it in America. But more importantly, for our purposes here today at this conference, we are learning some pretty important lessons that we think are relevant for philanthropy as we do this work. One is that our demographic changes mean that we must pay particular attention to being able to articulate a coherent vision for this country that truly does include all of us across race, class, and generation. From the white senior in Ohio to the immigrant domestic worker in New York, the African American veteran in Georgia to the LGBT young person in Arizona. Sometimes those visions will necessarily be longer term, but we must, and this is an opportunity to, look ahead at who we are becoming as a nation and shape it in our values. Embrace it in its totality and seize the moment to shape the future together. None of us can do it alone, which is why we must work across these lines. And if we do not, we risk greater political polarization, particularly in this economic climate. Second, building this inclusive intergenerational agenda for the future necessarily begins with values. Each of us can identify some core values that help us remember what matters most, that help us remember, help us bring out the best of who we are. When we build initiatives based on values, we can both celebrate our diversity and have a strong foundation to build social change work on. This is only becoming more and more important as the changing role of money in politics means that hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent on political ads that are rooted in fear and division, speaking to the worst in who we are every election cycle. The only antidote to that is to really reground ourselves all year round, every year, in the values like respect, care, opportunity, and democracy. Dare I say love, the stuff that our grandmothers teach us. 3, these movements build through the power of story and relationship. We build strong connections with one another across very different realities when we begin to understand one another's stories. We build human connection and relationships, and in that context, it's organizing that really matters. Community organizing is quite simply listening and sharing stories in order to build the relationships that will change the world around us. Organizing matters, and we've seen it again and again. And last year, we and our partners took the opportunity of an election year to talk to more than 500,000 senior voters in 5 states about the issues that they care about. We built relationships across age, race, and class, experience, and what we learned changed what we care about and how we see the world forever. And that's what it's all about. 4th, and finally, we believe that this is a moment for an investment in women, not as a special interest group, but as visionaries and agents of the kind of 21st century social change that was most needed in this moment. Today, women are more than half of the paid workforce, more than half of the electorate with a longer average life expectancy, and unfortunately still much more likely to live in poverty. Those poverty rates are even higher among women of color, as many of us know. And I don't believe that it's an accident that domestic workers have led us towards the kind of win-win solutions that they have. Because when life begins to work better for low-income women, it begins to change for all of us. Now, particularly in a moment where we risk unprecedented levels of inequality and polarization, low-income women can be our Jedis, to use a Star Wars metaphor, on the front lines, helping us to see what we can't quite always see ourselves, and to help us find the way to safety and victory for all of us. This moment of change is fundamentally an opportunity for all of us to transform our economy and relationships in our values. We believe that it's within reach and that we can see the seeds of it everywhere, even in our own families. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I am honored to be here, and thank you, Ed. Thanks to Gara for getting me involved in this. I'm sure you all have the experience of Gara getting you involved in things that got to be bigger and bigger as time went on. But I also find this absolutely fascinating discussion, working as I do as, as the lawyer for the people of the state of New York, but really seeing my work in the context of larger political trends. And I prefer to think of politics in the long term. And I gather that that's one of the questions that is being debated today. Now, the 2 people who just preceded me, Andrew has been hawking me for many, many years about how much we have to use technology and to do things. I barely understand a lot of what he says, but my daughter explains it to me, and then it makes perfect sense. And Jenna, I know from her work, and I was very proud to be involved with her changing the consciousness of people in New York State till we were able to pass the Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights. I remember you coming with your crew to my synagogue and getting them jazzed up. And what I want to talk about today is something that has been exemplified by both of these speakers. Not about technology or strategy, but really about how we frame up the choices that are before us if you want to take a serious look at philanthropy's role in changing public policy. I know that there are a lot of foundations that have spent many, many years providing services, seeking regulatory changes, and that there is now in the new world, not just of technology, but in post-Citizens United America, an important moment to step back and take a look at what we're doing and how we frame what we're doing, how we think about what we're doing. I respectfully submit that this can all be summed up, and I'll use everyone's favorite Supreme Court decision as an example, with the following assertion. Citizens United will go the way of Plessy v. Ferguson. It will be overturned. Its offensive ideas will be repudiated, but it is largely dependent on people like you to determine how long it will take for us to accomplish that. And what I mean is very simple. There are two essential ways to operate in politics. There are two essential ways to invest your money and resources in moving public policy. And I wrote an article a few years ago outlining this and have done some follow-up speeches about it. In my view, there are two kinds of work that I do in American politics: transactional political work and transformational political work. I have to do both. They're both part of my job. Transactional politics is pretty straightforward. What's the best deal I can get today on a health care bill or a gun safety bill or a drug reform bill? What do I have to do to elect someone who's an important ally of mine in the next election? Transactional politics is about being pragmatic about current realities, the state of public opinion today, and it's all about getting the best possible results in the circumstances here and now. Transformational politics is the work we do today to ensure that the deal we can get on health care or guns or immigration reform in a year or 5 years or 20 years is better than the deal we can get today. So transformational politics, and I consider both of the speakers who preceded me transformational political activists. It's about changing the way people conceive of issues and frame issues and opening people's minds to better possibilities about politics or economics or actually about human nature, and to move away from an old frame that prevents us from seeing and embracing policies that will make our lives better. Now, to be frank, I don't think this is a big secret. I approach public policy from the perspective of a progressive Democrat. But I always have to tip my hat to the conservative movement when I talk about transformational work, because the greatest transformational work that has been done in America over the last 30 years has been done by the far right. They have been unbelievably successful. During a period, one could argue that too many of our resources were spent on transactional politics. They've been very successful in seeing that there's an investment in changing people's fundamental assumptions for the long-term good, or bad, depending on your point of view. But the underlying assumptions about the role of government in the economy have been transformed by this movement. You think about it, they built an infrastructure of think tanks, media outlets, grassroots organizations, and professional societies, much of it funded by philanthropy. And I would argue that those investments in the transformational infrastructure of the contemporary conservative movement have had much more of an impact on the trajectory of American politics than all of their spending on either electoral campaigns or on campaigns to pass particular pieces of legislation over the last 30 to 40 years. The conservative movement sold Americans on the idea that government is less efficient than the private sector, that less regulation means more growth. They convinced millions of Americans of a magical free market in which most of the wealth naturally flows to a tiny portion of the population and that exists or would exist in the absence of government. And to me, most despicably, and this is something I spent many years of my life, an area I've spent many years of my life working on and I work on today, over the last 30 or 40 years, they convinced millions of Americans of both parties that our own safety depends on the mass incarceration of millions of young African and American and Latino men. They did their job well. And I feel as though we're at a moment where some of us who see progress as leading in a different direction have to make some choices about whether we're going to continue to focus on the transactional or we're going to invest in more transformational work. There have been examples of progressive success over the last 30 years also. I want to, and people here have funded it, so I want to pay my respects to that. And certainly I think Ai-jen and Andrew are at the leads of advocacy for what it really is another form of transformational political movement. But successful transformational politics. And I was fortunate enough to be involved in the transactional work when we repealed New York's Rockefeller drug laws. We had the worst drug laws in the country. They were one of the first mandatory sentencing laws that were passed in the United States. And the transactional work that I did literally was to go door to door to others. I was in the state senate at the time, other state senators, because I only had a 1-vote edge, and I got 32 votes, and that's what I needed. And I had to edit the bill as I went from senator to senator to make sure I had the votes to pass. That was good transactional work. But it was only possible because the Open Society Institute and other foundations had invested so heavily in the transformational work that went on in the decades before that. And we reframed the notion of what mass incarceration of drug offenders was about. When I would talk in the years leading up to the repeal and travel around New York State, nobody I was talking to usually knew what the Rockefeller drug laws were. But because of the transformational work that had been done so amazingly by the network that was assembled and paid for through Philanthropy, pretty much everyone, even like small town audiences upstate, they all knew they were bad. You know, saying we should repeal the Rockefeller drug laws. They were like, you know, we had draconian appended to the front of Rockefeller drug laws. You thought the first part of the phrase was draconian by the time we were done with the transformational work. And that's what enabled us to do the transactional work. We shifted public consciousness and got people to see nonviolent drug offenses not as a law enforcement problem, but as a public health problem. Similarly, I know a lot of people here have been involved in the efforts successful in New York recently to pass marriage equality laws. The transactional work in 2011 to get the votes together to force the leaders of the state Senate here to bring the marriage equality bill to the floor to get the votes to pass it. That was good transactional work. But it was only made possible by decades of transformational work to change public awareness about our LGBT brothers and sisters, and to change popular culture, which is a tremendously important part of transformational work. I mean, listening and telling stories doesn't have to be done in any sort of formal atmosphere. All we do all day is listen and tell stories. You have to, if we can get engaged in changing the way those stories are told, we're well on our way to transformational politics. So let me note that all of the great progressive movements in American history depended, at least in part, on philanthropy to get them going. And I want to bring this back to where I started. The Civil Rights Movement did not succeed when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Movement succeeded when all across our country, black and white Americans looked at each other and left behind the assumptions of the past and saw fellow human beings and fellow Americans. It was the transformation of consciousness that led to the transactional work that the politicians always rush in for. You know, politicians are always there to sign the bill once the transformational work has been done, and you know, it's easy to actually close the deal. I would note that philanthropists have always been at the beginning of significant movements, whether it's the women's suffrage movement, the labor movement, the civil rights movement, and politicians are always there at the end. None of the transformational movements on the right or left that I've referred to here was ever started by an elected official. So for whatever it's worth, for those of you who are thinking about how heavily to weigh in on the election of myself or my colleagues, to me, there is a deeper level that we have to address if we're going to actually be able to engage in the transactional work you want us to engage in on many issues. So coming back to Citizens United, and Plessy v. Ferguson. If we're going to overturn Citizens United, which I think we will, we have to understand the assumptions that lead people to think it's okay and it makes sense. And we have to dig deeper than that one Supreme Court opinion because it's based on a notion that money equals speech, which comes from an earlier Supreme Court decision in a case called Buckley v. Vallejo. Now, to me, that is a fundamentally un-American, anti-democratic proposition. Money equals speech. A multi-billionaire has 10,000 times or 100,000 times the free speech rights of an ordinary citizen. I don't think that when you think about it that way, I don't think it makes much sense. I don't think it's consistent with our Constitution. I don't think you can have equal justice under law or equal protections of the laws if you allow that to go forward. But frankly, after Buckley v. Vallejo in '76, there really was not much of a transformational response to try and root out that and challenge that basic assumption. And that's what underlies Citizens United and all the other bad decisions about money and politics that have come since then. And what we need is, I know there was some discussion earlier about whether or not people think that their foundation world is too timid or not, or whether, and it's as usual, everyone thinks they're doing great and that everyone else is too timid or something like that. This is common in polling in every group. But I would urge you that there is a special role for philanthropy in movement building and in transforming people's ideas about communication and the internet, transforming people's ideas about those who work to help us and aspire to live their lives alongside us with respect and dignity. The transformation of public awareness about domestic workers or about how you use the internet or about race or gender or sexual orientation is all about transformational work. And I would like to close by citing my favorite act of philanthropy in American modern political history, which took place in 1930. And this is kind of what I think some of us are looking for when we say less timidity is in order. And believe me, I give the same speech when I address the Democratic leadership of Congress, where less timidity is clearly in order. The American Fund for Public Service made a grant of $100,000 in 1930 to a small group of activists in the NAACP and Howard Law School, led by someone who's a role model for the lawyers in my office, Charles Hamilton Houston, who was then the dean of Howard Law School. And the $100,000 was given, and this is a quote, was given to support, quote, a large-scale, widespread, dramatic campaign to give the Southern Negro his constitutional rights, his political and civil equality, and therewith a self-consciousness and self-respect which would inevitably tend to affect a revolution in the economic life of the country. Now that's what I call a transformational statement of philanthropy. And if we see more willingness to look for the large term, now I have to point out, this was given in 1930. Houston, who didn't even live to see the conclusion of this, and his protege Thurgood Marshall and the others who brought this about, they didn't conclude their work until we were into the 1960s. Plessy was overturned in 1954. The Civil Rights Act was signed in 1964. Many of them knew they were dedicating themselves to a cause they would not live to see completed. But that's transformational political work, and whether we like it or not, if we're not doing it, someone else is. So I hope that as you consider how to do your work in the days and weeks and months ahead, you'll consider this. I'm all for trying to get the best deal we can get today. But if you're not working to change public consciousness so that we can get a better deal in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, the other side is. And when they meet you, they will beat you. Thank you.
Jim, Stan, Angela? So our new speakers should know the other three people who have joined you have put together and produced components of our program today. One covering education, a second covering healthcare, a third covering poverty, equity, access. So let me just begin with what may be a complicated question on a very serious topic. Do Stan, Angela, Jim, have you any particular reflections on any of the three speeches or three brief talks that you heard? Yeah, take a mic.
I thought they were a wonderful compliment to each other. The notion that we have to have a transformational framework that we have to understand the tools that we can use to achieve the transformation. And all wisdom comes from the ground. And so I thought together they really created a wonderful piece. And I think they really set us up for the conversation that we have to have now within the context of philanthropy about exactly what is the role. And one of the things that I think we haven't quite picked up yet is that, as you talked about Charles Houston, that image, that vision was not given to him by philanthropy. It responded to a vision that he had. And we have left out of this equation that so much of the good idea comes from the ground, and really good philanthropy knows how to follow it.
What's that, Jim?
Yeah, it's interesting. Lots of themes over the whole conference, and I like to think we live in America where there's more sharing of goals than not sharing of goals. But I think we have very different visions of how to get from one place to the other right now. I always look for the solution where there's a little bit of a win-win, in it, and I think there are more of those out there. And actually, what Ajen said inspired me to realize that here's an example. We have an aging population, and that troubles some of us. And then we're worried about productivity. We're worried about where we fit into the world globally, especially with some of the items that you were showing us about competition. And what you described, Adrian, in some ways is this is how we can care for elders and build a strong population of people who are going to be the mainstay of our society in 20, 30 years. And what a win-win situation. I mean, and the children of those home care workers are going to be the kids going to Harvard and to NYU. And to me, those are the ways we should think of how do we, I read Brooks's column today, and I usually love his columns, but I really didn't like this one because he was basically saying we should take care of the elderly less and invest more in the future. And I don't see it that way. I mean, I think that we have to figure out how to do both, and I thought you gave a vision that might work that way.
Stan?
Well, I thought the three discussions were very helpful, and I thought the discussion about technology and the changes in terms of how millennials are thinking about communication is a strategy and tools that apply to every issue that we're talking about. And I thought the discussion about coalition building to meet the needs of people who are left out in society also transcends every issue, whether it's education or healthcare. But I think the Attorney General's comments about buying into a long-term transformational strategy is a lesson that applies not to philanthropy, but it applies to every segment of society. And there's nothing that philanthropists or philanthropoids can do operating alone without the kind of vision and the kind of tools that we're talking about here. And I think the real challenge is to get people who have resources, and they sound like a lot, but they're really not that much money. But to use that small amount of money to leverage all the other segments of society to fulfill the kind of transformational vision that the Attorney General was talking about. So I think the question about next steps is for people who have the small amount of money to give out, not to be operating in alone, but to be figuring out how that could be a leverage to empower the kind of change that we really need to have. So it could be a very optimistic discussion that knits together all these things to resolve the challenges that we have in education and healthcare and the environment and public policy.
Does Eric, do you have a thought more? Or else I'll go on to another idea of a question. You might have an idea.
I thought all three of us were very good.
Right?
But
That's what we planned, so it was all right.
But I do, and I particularly appreciate the observation that the movements do come from the human spirit and from people who stand up and reconceive things. And those of us who are either philanthropists or public officials, our job is to help bring those forth. I mean, this is, it never ceases to amaze me how important many of my colleagues in public office think they are. And once again, just a little humbling to consider, not one of the great movements that they attempt now desperately to associate themselves with was ever started by an elected official. This comes from our culture, it comes from the home, it comes from listening and telling stories. And it's our job to try and come up with the tactics, come up with the technological strategy, and come up with a framework to get to deliver on the spirit that it really never is always there and always seeking to be brought into being.
Andrew.
Eric, I think I speak for everybody in the room that we're very, very lucky to have an Attorney General who is as thoughtful and as dedicated as you are. I mean, it's really amazing to see you in your role, and you deserve a lot of credit. But now I'm going to ask you a challenging question. So the framing of transactional versus transformational politics was beautiful and very well articulated, but let's just talk about the broadband. We are doing transactional deals in order to get that deal today that is handicapping our ability to achieve transformational politics as you frame it. And so they are opposed to each other in many cases. And we're not doing a strong enough job on the transformational side calling out our brethren who are doing the transactional about how they are screwing themselves for taking the deal today that prevents the solution from happening tomorrow. So how are we, if you're going to help us lead this shift in thinking, going to be able to convince people not to take the transactional deal in order to be able to achieve the transformational one that we are hoping for?
Well, this is a great example, but I think if you will look across the broad range of public policy all over America today, you'll see transactions that I think most of us would think are not as good as they should be taking place, whether it is about criminal justice policy or the environment or issues related to equality or about technology. And I think the challenge is this. There are always people who stand to benefit from a transaction who will spend a lot to get the transaction closed. And those of us who aspire to somewhat of a broader way of thinking about life and what we think is important in life have to be prepared to devote ourselves to reminding all of the rest of the American people that transactions take place in a framework. And ultimately, you know, the tactics and the strategy and the techniques we use, sometimes we lose sight of the most fundamental principles. And I think that the idea of, and it's easy in my job. My job is about equal justice under law. Every day people ask me, what are we doing here? It's just like one set of rules for everyone, equal justice under law. And that really pretty much covers it. Anything inconsistent with that, anything that produces a divide where some have access and some don't, to me is not on the mission. But that's a very clear mission for a very clear office. I think that you are looking at, in your particular field, you are looking at a phenomenon that's true everywhere. I think that every day, look at what's going on in Washington now about guns, right? I assure you, I fought with the NRA in Albany so much when I was in the state Senate. I'm on a first-name basis with all of them. First of all, I know who their families are, their kids are. They had my name on a screen thing with a sniper scope that would go up and down it and blow my name up. So I've just watched as they've built a transformational movement, and folks who think more as I do have failed. And it's great now that there are people putting up money and giving money, and Congresswoman Giffords and her husband, they're starting something. But you're not going to get much of a transaction that is satisfying in Washington on this basis until, without the last 30 years of you can't make up the transformational work. You can't make it up. The opportunity now going forward is to do this. So the question is this: who's going to invest in the bill this year, and who's going to invest in something that may not bear fruit for another 20 years? And I think that there's a lot of times when you're trying to close a transaction that you have to step back and say, okay, let me get to the assumptions that are underlying the reason people don't see this way or won't do this way. And I think it's just a different shift in the framework. We have to be engaged in all the transactional work. We have to try and fight hard every day on legislative battles and every year or two on political battles. But what is the movement for broadband access doing to uproot? Actually, you do this all the time personally, but to uproot more systemically the assumptions, that the lack of the ability to see this as something other than a consumer product, to see this as something that's more in the nature of a public good. That, to me, would be the transformational work in your particular sector. I don't know how much time people spend on that, or how much you're funded to do that.
Right. let me push this to another question. Andrew, did you want to say something? I wanted to reflect back on last night's conversation. David Gergen spoke with three well-known and very significant philanthropists or budding philanthropists, people who knew this field well. One of the things that struck me later about the conversation, and I have tremendous respect and regard for all of them, was how much of their work, it seemed to me, was individual. They did their activities kind of on their own, and there was no apparent conversation to me about how does A work with B or C work with D or whatever it may be. Here we're talking about common visions. Here we're talking about a philanthropic world that doesn't have a lot of money and somehow a need to aggregate vision and power. Did we learn anything or have any thoughts about that aggregation of power and the ability to use it from the side of philanthropy over the last day?
I wasn't here either, Ajin. I wasn't here, but that's not going to keep me from speaking on it. I actually think that this is a very important issue. I say to the staff that I work with all the time that if ever we pick out a goal that we can achieve on our own, we need to throw that away and go to a bigger one, because we really shouldn't waste our time on things that we can do alone. We have to set huge goals. And as we're doing that, we have to do what Ajin spoke so beautifully about, and that's finding the win-win for everybody. And that's hard work. It requires a lot of give, and it requires a lot of vision. The thing that I'm often am struck with is how the American people, too many of them, are being nostalgic for a time that never was, while they're avoiding a future that is inevitable. And this inevitable future, a future in which we become a world nation of diversity, is the thing that will define us. It's full of assets. It's full of possibility, but we have to figure out how to work together across boundaries, set big goals, and everybody find the way that achieving that goal helps us all to be better. That's the toughest work we will ever do, but if you think that you can achieve it alone, you're absolutely mistaken.
Well, I was here last night, and I did hear the discussion, and have been here throughout, and I think that the sort of the conversation that set the tone for the discussion was just a little bit too theoretical and a little bit too sort of like big picture about philanthropy as opposed to what the philanthropy is about. And I think I participated in the session on education.
Right.
Leave it to the rest to talk about what they discussed in the other substantive areas. But it was much more practical about here are the very specific challenges described as a crisis for the nation in terms of educating young people in a way that we want them to be educated, and talk specifically and concretely about what does philanthropy do together with government, together with civil society, to address these challenges in a very substantive way. It's not that we don't have to have a conversation about why it's a good thing to give money away, or that different people have different approaches to doing that. And I think that's sort of an interesting conversation, but it got much more practical and tactical when we talked about the specific issues and the challenges ahead. And that's where it gets down to this collaborative enterprise. The tools are critically important, but if people operate separately and in a silo, we're probably not going to get anything other than some good examples of a good grant and not the resolution of the critical problems.
Good, thanks, Dan.
I would just add that I think that in addition to the visioning and the collaboration, there's probably 3 levels deeper of strategy that we actually need to develop. Very rarely are we talking about strategy at the level of the relationship between the transformative and the transactional on any issue. And very rarely are we talking about strategy with people in the field, across issue areas, across constituencies, with philanthropy together, trying to develop a long-term arc of what it will take to address these issues. And I actually find a lot of inspiration from the LGBT movement in this area. Is anyone from the Gill Foundation here?
I don't think so.
Well, I think the LGBT movement, there was a process that, and I'm sure that many people are much closer to this process than I am, but my understanding is that there was a real intentional process of long-term strategy development that was about state-level strategy, national-level strategy. It was about civic engagement and policy work and advocacy. It was about many layers of transactions and transformations and a national policy or a national popular culture change strategy that was integrated, and a multi-year investment on the part of funders with field partners to actually realize some of those transactional and transformational goals. And here we are 10 years later, and it's a different world around those issues, around LGBT issues. And so I think that there are models and examples of where we've seen success. It just requires, I would say, even several layers deeper of strategy than what we've ever known in this moment of change in this country.
So I think actually the way that the 2 days have gone has really worked nicely from hearing from high net worth people last night giving away money. And then today we heard more from more organized bureaucratic philanthropies like the one I run. And I came away feeling good about the diversity of how we go about doing our business. It's sort of like reading the article about how Apple develops products versus the way Samsung develops products. I'm glad we have both polar opposite approaches. We'll probably end up getting those cell phones you're talking about more quickly because of that. And so the high net worth people last night clearly go with their gut a lot more than I think I do, running a foundation that has lots of different interests, lots of different trustees, lots of publics that we care about, and lots of staff that all want to be empowered and have something to say. And I think we play an important role, but I also think that the folks who can go with their gut, or folks who really want to do collaborative work as opposed to people who want to work on smaller issues. So I come away feeling good that there's diversity, and I don't think there's any one path that is necessarily the right one.
Great. Let's take a couple of questions or points of view from the audience. You guys are participants like we are. Yes.
Ed, I'm Jim Posner. I would like to share one of my favorite